My name is Shannon Blocker. I am the Pottawatomie County Agriculture Extension Agent, and I've been here since 2017, but I have been an extension agent for K-State Research and Extension since 2002. So I've been at it quite a while. I have kind of made through my experience as well as my master's degree, soil fertility, my area of expertise. And so today I am recording so that I can share it with those that maybe can't join us today. Some information about advanced nutrient management. I got one suggestion for topics at least. So if we have other questions or things that you want me to do or cover instead of what I actually have presented, I'm happy to do so. We'll try to make this efficient and useful for you guys so that you can use it in your operations or share it with others as well. So just to begin, again, the affirmative action and equal opportunity employer information. All right, so advanced nutrient management. My picture is probably a little pixelated, but when you get into advanced nutrient management, you start talking about things that are just beyond the basics. When I was working on my master's degree, they were fairly new in their nitrogen sensor technology. And so those kinds of things I'd classify as advanced. There is so much information that you could share that's in this category. Actually, way back in probably 2003 or 4, K-State Research and Extension had a 2-day, I believe it was, workshop for agents to really kind of fill us in on this. And this was really before I got started, or at least very far into my master's degree. And it may have led to my interest in this particular area. And I actually have been pulling out that notebook and using some of that information to put this together, because there's a lot of places to go and a lot of resources that are really useful for over a long period of time. So the things that I'm going to try to focus on a little bit today, and I'm going to go quickly through several of them and maybe take a little bit more time on others. And again, if you have something that you want me to focus on instead, please just jump up and answer or suggest that I kind of direct myself another way. I will not be offended. The one thing that's on here that I'm not going to talk about today, because quite honestly, I want to try my best to stay really close to that hour time frame or less, which will be hard for me, is the tissue sampling. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that, but quite honestly, just not enough time, but I'd be happy to at a later time if you're interested or want to know more about it, or if you want to redirect me to covering that. I just won't have any slides in that facet of information. So the first place I wanted to start was to talk about essential plant nutrients from soil. And this seems basic, but it's not, because there's so many things to keep in mind. We know the big three. Everybody knows the big three if they worked in fertilizers at all, with nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And those are the ones that are used in the heaviest and largest amounts from the soil. The secondary nutrients are calcium, magnesium, and sulfur, and they're used a little bit less than the primary, but significantly more than the micronutrients. And there are a bunch of micronutrients. And quite honestly, the one at the bottom, nickel, we went many years until probably the mid-1990s or so before we recognized it as an essential plant nutrient. So there are a lot of things to learn. I did star 3 of these nutrients, and it's actually one from each category, because these are considered the mobile nutrients, and that becomes really important when we talk about soil testing. So if we're going to do soil testing for any of those 3 that have a star, we need to take a deep profile soil test. And so ideally that means 24 inches deep. And you may tell me, I don't have 24 inches of soil. I hit rock first. And that does happen, definitely in Pottawatomie County and other counties as well. But as deep as you can go is really the only way to accurately evaluate those 3 nutrients. A lot of people will do a sulfur soil test on the 6 inches, which is what we use for pretty much everything else. And honestly, I've tried and talked with specialists and tried to use CEC and clay content and a whole bunch of things to try to figure out how we might base that on something. And the answer is you really can't. So really, when it comes to sulfur, if you don't do a soil test that's as deep as you can or up to 24 inches, it's really not worth it to do that soil test. And I kind of will show you how we get around that and deal with it as well. And that applies for nitrogen and chloride as well too. So plant nutrients are taken up by the plants as ions, and they're either cations that have a plus, or they are anions, which have a minus. And it's kind of interesting to look at this list because in general, the things that are over here on the cation side, those are the things that are essentially immobile in soil. They don't go anywhere in that format when they have a plus tied to them. They just stay put essentially unless they're picked up and taken on by the plant itself. Down here under non-nutrients is aluminum, which becomes important when we talk about really low pH soils. So not very common around here, but in sometimes when we get closer to 5s and 5.5s and things like that, I believe it's the calcium is replaced by aluminum, and that causes a toxicity since it is a non-nutrient. So nope, it's sulfur, that's right. I was trying to remember which one it was, but it was something that was opposite or something like that. In anions, they have a negative charge, and most of these, with the exception of basically phosphate and technically boron, they are fairly mobile in the soil. In other words, they move around, and it's because most of our organic matter or our mineral soil has a negative charge. And so they are kind of pushed away out of the soil, while the cations are attracted to the soil and the organic matter structure. And that's really why, in a simple way, that nutrients act the way they do when we apply them and things like that. So, all right, so the relative importance of the soil supply mechanisms. There's essentially 3 different ways that nutrients can be taken up by a plant. And one of them is called interception. And it tends to be a less important one, but essentially what that means is that the root goes exploring, and if it runs into the nutrient, it takes it up. Mass flow essentially means that that nutrient is dissolved in water, and if there's water present, that's how it moves and is taken in by the plant, and that basically with water. And diffusion is kind of your tissue, high concentration and low concentration. So you can see that for some nutrients, mass flow, for example, nitrogen is really, really an important way that nutrient is taken up. But for phosphorus and potassium, you can see that difference in concentration in the tissue semi-permeable membrane essentially results for why and how a plant takes up nutrients. I did share this one last week, and this is corn, just to kind of emphasize to you how each nutrient takes up a different portion of the nutrient at different times in its life. And one that's kind of interesting to me is here with, in the case of nitrogen, you'll see here that essentially it doesn't take up much nitrogen until about the V10 stage. And then from then on, it really kind of goes to town. And we'll talk about that more later. But some nutrients take up more at earlier stages. Some of them put them more into the grain, and all of those things really influence the how and when those nutrients need to be available to the plant for optimum growth. And then these are some of the micronutrients. I don't really want to go into a huge amount of detail, but you can see that, you know, iron has this weird bump in it. So it's kind of an interesting one as well. And again, I've also shared this one each time. Just want to emphasize that if there's one single thing that we can get right about a soil, if we can, we need to get the pH right. If we can keep that pH between like 6.5 and 7, pretty much everything is going to be in a pretty ideal amount and availability for nutrients and for the plant to use them. And you can see that phosphorus, one of the things that happens with phosphorus is it gets into some of its organic formats and unavailable, even though it's still there, when the pH drops. So that's why that becomes important to us. Again, it didn't disappear, but it's just not available. And the reason why iron, not an agronomic crop, but definitely one of the easiest ones to talk about, a pin oak tree, why they end up with green veins and yellow kind of light green leaves is that a lot of the soil pHs are, 7.5 and higher, and essentially not enough of the iron that is in the soil anyway is available to that plant, and that plant happens to be very sensitive to that problem. So, all right. So, any questions so far, or anything that you want me to spend more time on, or anything in that format? Okay.
Go for it.
All right. So, grid or zone soil sampling. One of the things that I get questions about sometimes is how many soil samples should I take from an 80-acre field or a 40-acre field, or even a yard, for example. People ask me, how many soil samples is necessary in order to accomplish that? And that's not subsamples. That is how many samples that you would submit that you are willing to treat differently. And so this is an example of a field that I've worked with this landowner on, that I went to the Web Soil Survey and I pulled off the information from the Web Soil Survey about what the soil types are, and some of the characteristics of those soils as well are available there. There's even information on the Web Soil Survey, so if you want to find it for your farm fields, you can just type into Google Web Soil Survey and you can find it. It is a really powerful tool that I think is pretty severely underutilized, and it's essentially all the information that was available in the old-fashioned, here it is, and more, in the old-fashioned paper soil survey that was released. I do still have one copy of Pottawatomie County here in my office, but all that information and more is available on the online and interactive version. I went ahead and made the different units larger because they're just too small on my map to kind of show you how they can be seen. But you'll see that this field has the top part, or the north part, is all one soil type. It's a Rossville soil and a silt loam, and it makes up about half of this total field that I mapped out. This 7150 kind of follows this line, and this is where, honestly, where there's like a level change for the flooding that occurs sometimes on this field. And you can see that it is a Bellevue, and it's also a silt loam. Then down below, we have a 7160, and then we have a 7058. And so you can see all of that. And if we were live for the soil survey, you can click on that blue and it will tell you how deep that soil, how what layers are in it, and all those kinds of interesting pieces of information. And then again, from there, you can make maps of the productivities of that soil and all sorts of things like that as well. Personally, one of the most important things that I like to consider when I'm trying to decide, am I going to grid sample this or zone sample this, or even just do a whole field, is, am I willing to treat areas that are different? If you are going to put fertilizer in the buggy and you're just going to treat the whole field the same no matter what, then quite honestly, grid sampling or zone sampling is not going to do anything for you. If you are willing to, say, run the buggy with a different mix up here than you would down here, or maybe the whole part down here, well then, you know, treating those two areas different warrants finding out what their characteristics are. So that's really the most important thing in my opinion. And the longer that you have worked with that farm, fertilized that farm, grown crops on that farm, you can see those places. You know that in the field, in this corner, it is either less productive or more productive than the other parts of the field. And a lot of times the soil map explains those differences rather well. So this earlier, like in 2018, this producer or landowner decided to soil sample, and he soil sampled this field in a quadrant kind of system that's pretty common that people might use. And you can see that in some ways that is a very good way to go about sampling this field, because it also kind of blends out most of the soil differences. So that was how this producer chose to do it in 2018. And then this is kind of the results that we got from that soil testing. So you can see that really the phosphorus levels were fairly consistent, and the potassium levels were not as consistent, but in reality, none of these were at levels that were concerning as far as that critical level for potassium of 130. So that worked. We made fertilizer recommendations. If they wanted to build and maintain, which was important to this producer, the K-State recommendations for that basically were between 40 and 55 pounds of phosphate. So that you can see there as well. Then in 2020, this producer decided that he would go ahead and have this field grid sampled, just to really see and learn more about this soil and be able to make management decisions related to that. So he did contract with one of our local dealers and had it sampled in basically a 2.5 acre grid. There are costs associated with that, usually paid by the acre for most of the local dealers. And then the local dealers that you may work with have, all three of them that I contact have at least a bin one bin variable rate spreader. And the one bin variable rate spreader from one of the local businesses could actually be rented out. In other words, you could apply it yourself and use it yourself. And then they had 2, 3, and 4, in some cases, bin variable rate spreaders. And the number of bins is really helpful to know, you know, how many different things are you going to have at different rates. And so the grid sampling can help come up with that prescription or that recommendation of what you need to apply to the field once it's been grid sampled. I just don't expect you to read this at all. I would have a hard time with it. In fact, even in the sample that I was handed, this was very, very small print. But in general, the most important things that I want you to see here is that these nutrients, all the things that we could soil sample for, the results themselves are going to be the same for the most part, no matter what lab, as long as it's accredited and a quality controlled lab, no matter what lab you send it to. Yes, there may be some additional information that K-State Lab doesn't do very often, but if you really wanted them to, they would be happy to do all of the exact same tests. But I will talk about later why some of these tests are basically pointless, and it would be better to not waste your money in doing some of them at different times, depending on who you're working with for your soil sampling. So this is the map of the soil pH, and this is the map from that producer that or the landowner that he shared with me. And one of the interesting things on it is it looks very, very different, doesn't it? But if you look closely, the colors that are green range between 5.7 and it looks like about 6.6 here on the screen. And it's really hard to tell the differences between those areas. And so it's really important to go back to those results so that you understand what this information is telling you. Because in reality, based on K-State's current recommendations, anything that is 5.8 and below that you're gonna, grow soybeans or corn on is the only ones that you would need to consider a lime application on. So essentially we're looking at only 2 acres of this field really needing lime. But maybe you're old school, and I wouldn't question you if you are, and you want to make sure that everything is up to at least a 6.4, which was our, back when I started with K-State Research and Extension, that was kind of the minimum that we tried to shoot for. And it would be the same if it were alfalfa or something like that. So now we have 23 acres out of this 134. And then essentially 25 acres of this at most needs some lime application. And you can really think about how that would pay for itself pretty quickly, because if you'd had, for whatever reason, sampled and it triggered a lime application and it told you you needed to put a ton of lime on per acre, that would be 134 tons, right? Well, if only 25 acres actually need it, now you're only buying 25 acres or 25 tons of lime. So when you choose to grid soil sample, the application of lime is the #1 way that it pays for itself, or essentially becomes something useful that you might use. So again, this is the buffer pH, which is how you decide how much lime you need, and the lime rec map. But you'll also see that there's a little bit of discrepancy between this lab and this provider and what K-State would do, in that there are parts of this field that they're recommending 3 tons on. And if you were tilling that with a moldboard plow, maybe that would be true. But if you are not, if you are just going to be no-tilling, which is what this farm field does, that reduces that amount down to like 1.25 tons. So it's really important to keep the depth of incorporation in mind anytime you look at line recommendations, because there are just as many negative things that can happen from too high of pH as there are from too low. And honestly, it's harder to overcome those negative aspects of a too high pH, because the only way to lower that pH is with sulfur, elemental sulfur, and essentially it's cost prohibitive to do that on a farm scale. Maybe in your vegetable garden, but definitely not on a farm scale. So I went ahead and kind of made my own little map to show you guys where actually we might need some fertilizer, or sorry, some lime or some adjustment. And really there was only 1 2.5 acre grid part that had a sample, soil sample below the 5.9. So I marked it with the purple, and then the areas that are blue are in that 6 to 6.5 or 6.4. So again, you're looking at that 25 or maybe up to 28 tons of ag lime versus needing more if you happen to soil sample and trigger a recommendation for the entire field, for example. Okay. Phosphorus is a really important one to soil test for too, because you can see in this field there was an enormous amount of variability. And in a portion of this field, there was a soil test of 10 parts per million. In another portion of this field, there was a soil test of 111 parts per million. These are very, very different numbers, and you would manage those very, very differently if you know that they're there. And so this is the recommendations that came from the contractor or the supplier, but they're pretty aggressive. And I said that it's not exactly that they are wrong, but the one thing that I would say is if you had a soil test of 111, I would not put any phosphorus on it. If you had a soil test between 91 and 102, I wouldn't put any phosphorus on it. Honestly, even if you're being very aggressive, I would not put any phosphorus on soil that has 50 parts per million or higher at all, ever, even if you're maintaining it. And so the idea here is that this provider was actually suggesting to put phosphorus on every single acre. It was just a variable amount of it. And I know that I talked to this landowner, and I kind of encouraged him to reconsider that or talk with the provider about that, because phosphorus is our #1 way that we're causing algae blooms and other problems associated with fresh water. And the grant that we get in Pottawatomie County, and maybe even Wabunsee, to pay for soil testing up to 10 a year is primarily because of phosphorus. So we want to keep phosphorus on the field and not have it wash away. When that phosphorus level is 50 parts per million and lower, that is a very low chance that it will do so. When it gets up to 100 or more, it's very likely that that phosphorus can wash away. And we don't want that to happen, and we don't want to cause problems in freshwater bodies and or the ocean in the end. So I went ahead again and kind of mapped this out. So the yellow spots were the locations where that soil test level was below the 20, which is the critical level with K-State Research and Extension's recommendations. So if you were trying to follow a sufficiency plan, you would really only need to fertilize these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 spots, or times 2.5 acres. But essentially, you would only need to fertilize those areas. If you are on a more of a build maintain type of process, you would want to do all of the sufficiency and all of the build maintain. But again, we're leaving pretty large areas of this field. I would say close to half of the field doesn't need any phosphorus fertilizer whatsoever because it's above that 30, which is kind of the upper limit of where we recommend that you truly build and maintain. So the recommendations from K-State are to keep it between 20 and 30. Again, I said if you want to be more aggressive, you could go up to 50, but it's not going to really pay for itself, but that's okay. But there's no reason to put anything on these other ones because they are well above 30, and time will bring them slowly down into an area where you might need to apply them again. All right, so not too bad that I'm doing so far. Anything else about grid sampling, zone sampling, anything about soil testing at all that you would like me to answer at this point?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Is that Doug?
Yeah, or you got the question?
Well,
You have a question, Dick?
Yeah, I do. What did you call? You said that we could Google to get those maps.
Yep.
What did you call that?
The Web Soil Survey. So
Web Soil Survey.
yep, WEB Soil Survey, and it will come up. It takes a little bit of finesse to navigate it, but it's a lot like Google Maps, except for it's all about soils. So it's a pretty awesome thing.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anything else anybody has? I guess I only got 2 of you. So all right. So now we're going to talk a little bit about nitrogen and nitrogen management, because really when you get into advanced nutrient management, nitrogen use efficiency and nitrogen loss become important things to consider and plan for and manage. So there are at least 4 ways that we refer to nitrogen loss occurring. And the reason that I put loss in quotes is that with the case of immobilization in particular, you're not really losing it, but it's no longer available. So nitrogen has a cycle, and there is both organic nitrogen and inorganic nitrogen in a soil at all times. And really, that's why we don't worry too much about high amounts of nitrogen in manure, because that nitrogen is in an organic format. And when it's in an organic format, essentially it's very, very hard to lose. It's part of the soil organic matter, and it's not going anywhere. But through natural processes of warmth and the microbes and those kinds of things, the amount of nitrogen that's in the organic form and the inorganic form ebbs and flows and fluxes throughout the growing season. The only nitrogen that a plant can take up is in the inorganic format. So it can really only pick it up when it is not in that organic matter type of portion. And so one thing that sometimes happens is if you have a really, really, really high residue level and you add some nitrogen fertilizer, that nitrogen fertilizer, which is inorganic at that point, essentially becomes immobilized because the microbes in the soil take it and use it to help break down the organic material in order to use it. So that's why in a really, really high residue situation, sometimes you have to give it a little shock of nitrogen, a little starter or something, so that you can promote that early growth and development. And then over time, that mineralization of the nitrogen will resupply the nitrogen inorganic base. So leaching does happen, not as much in Pottawatomie County or Wabunsee County as other locations. with the possible exception of the really deep soils that are close to the river bottom that are sandy. So it is basically nitrogen going through the profile and out to the bottom where the roots can no longer reach it. Denitrification happens most commonly in clay soils where that are ponded or stay wet for a long time. That process essentially makes that nitrogen disappear. And then volatilization is one that we know about because of urea, but essentially, and ammonium nitrate, not ammonium nitrate, but ammonium, come on, Shannon, anhydrous, is that if you don't seal it or place it underground, then there's some loss that could occur due to volatilization. So the two factors that are the biggest driver on nitrogen use efficiency are placement and time of application. So those are going to be the two that we really talk about. I did want to bring up that additives and specialty fertilizers can help sometimes under very specific soil conditions. There's been a lot of research done on N-Serve and phosphorus ones and all sorts of those things. And there are some situations where they help, but the vast majority of them are inconsistent in year to year, as well as soil type to soil type on whether they're effective. Because if you can figure out a way to avoid denitrification or the losses associated with denitrification in a very clay soil, that could be a very good and important thing in a wet year, but in a dry year, won't matter. And then leaching, if you have a sandy soil, maybe that might help. But again, if you have no moisture and you have no irrigation, then again, that's not going to be a problem either. So a little bit of information about mobile nutrients. Again, I mentioned that nitrogen is the biggest one. Sulfur and chloride are mobile nutrients. I just have some data for nitrogen, but you'll see here that using either ammonia or UAN that is knifed, so put into the soil in a no-till corn situation, resulted in significantly higher yields because that nitrogen was placed under the soil. There was no opportunity for volatilization or any other kind of loss associated with that placement on the surface. So you can see that there. I wanted to share this, not because I want you to read it all, but mostly because if you really want to go back to 2008, the fertilizer research material that was released by K-State will have a publication where I'm listed as the primary author because it is my thesis research. And so this is from Anderson County, so it's going to be a little bit different than here in this part of the world. But we were working with potassium, which is an immobile nutrient, another one that's similar in some ways, not the same in other ways, is phosphorus. And the reason I put immobile there is essentially because there's been both phosphorus and potassium work at K-State, and a lot of it. And essentially, when it really comes down to it, those nutrients are, the placement of them is not very important. There is no impact on anything other than leaf tissue. And leaf tissue is important, but if the most important thing is yield, you can see here that there was no significant differences in yields on all of these locations in all of this situation in the 2 years of research that I did. Now, I was looking at this research, and I recently, actually last week, 1 week ago today, I was moving my computer to get ready for this presentation, and I had a external hard drive sitting on my desk attached to the computer, and I wasn't paying attention, and I moved my computer and pulled that external hard drive off of my desk, and it's now dead. And I feel very scared because I contacted my old office professional, and essentially most of my data, I think, may be gone if I can't get it. But I was very curious because I was like, I remember what happened in 2008, but I don't remember why Westphalia had pretty cruddy soybean yields in 2007. And I started to read through my actual physical book of my thesis, and I commented about that, and I said, you know, that they did not get the timely rainfall that Ottawa and Harris and had got that year. So that was kind of an interesting thing, and you guys know it, and a producer knows it more than anybody, that, you know, rain in one field and you can be a mile away and it will be a very different situation. So that was interesting to me, and I was like, I can't remember why it was, but that was the reason in that particular year. But
I just assumed it was my brother's place.
It wasn't your brother's place, no, but it was someone in the neighborhood. Let's go with that. So
okay.
But yeah, so in my research, I worked with soybeans, but the second year I was relying on residual potassium applications to look at corn. And so here's the corn data. And again, we're not going to see anything that's significant other than leaf tissue. So leaf tissue, yeah, there's some significant differences, but when it comes right down to the money in the yield, you'll see that there's no significant differences either of those two locations. I did not get to do the Harris location that second year, but essentially, and again, Westphalia does look a little bit lower than the Ottawa, but they're not that different. They're different, but not that different. I learned a valuable, super valuable lesson about working with producers for on-farm research. And that was, you really have to communicate what you expect out of the variety that they might choose. And so this producer decided, and he's a great guy, no, not saying bad things about him at all, other than I didn't communicate with him. He decided to plant a non-Roundup ready corn, and he also decided to plant his corn earworm buffer, or essentially some of that, the corn that he had to have into the plot. So it really wasn't the most ideal situation, and the weeds took, basically ate my lunch. So to the point that I literally was out there with a push lawnmower between the rows trying to salvage my research. So what I wanted to say is that I have learned my lesson. So if anybody wants to do some research with me, I will do a better job and communicate more about expectations and what we want to get out of the research. Otherwise, you know, we'll end up with situations like this where it was only 65, and you can't explain that. There's no way to explain why a broadcast application with that high of a rate yielded that low, except for weed pressure. So, all right. So nitrogen fertilization timing is really important, and really it's one important second behind placement on how we can really adjust and change what we do to effectively manage our nitrogen. So you can see at that V10 stage, prior to that, you know, the plant is taking up some nitrogen, but it's doing it pretty slowly. In this kind of circle oval spot, we start going up pretty dramatically. Basically 7 pounds per acre per day of nitrogen is picked up from that V10, maybe through that V14 stage. So there's a lot of accumulation that's happening at that time. Approximately 30% of the nitrogen uptake occurs after flowering. So you can kind of see that here. I'm going to move this over here for a second. You can see that here, that by flowering kind of right here, we're only at somewhere in that, 70%. There's 30% that will occur after that point. More than 60% of the grain nitrogen is taken up in that post-flowering part. So that's important to keep in mind. And that irrigation and high clearance equipment open up the opportunity for a late application of nitrogen fertilizer. And quite honestly, it's one of those situations that if you have irrigation and or high clearance equipment, especially irrigation, you should take advantage of the opportunities to increase nitrogen use efficiency, because you can get by with less nitrogen and you can apply it when the crop needs it. And it will not denitrify, it will not leach as much, it will not go through any of those negative things that are associated with that. So here's some information about clay soils. Pot County definitely has some clay soils, but we also have some fairly sandy soils. But you can see that nitrogen application timing using UAN, which is half urea, does show a significant yield difference on a clay soil. Whether you do it at V6 or V10 was essentially no different, but doing it all pre-plant, the same amount total, had a significant lower yield, and then of course no nitrogen had a very significant less yield. But you can see that that's the case. So that was most likely denitrification that occurred from basically waterlogged soils is the most likely cause of that situation. And you can see that in this map, which is dry matter production, that at this kind of I don't know what this is going to be. It's going to be about 90 days through the end. That's where most of that split is going to occur. It's going to occur late in the season, and it will really make a difference at that point. However, like I said, the soil and the year can make a big difference on whether there's a difference or not, or a very significant difference or not. This is the same type of research in a higher yielding spot than the previous one. Likely not a clay soil, but and possibly under irrigation. But you can see that the pre-plant application of 160 pounds was a little less, but not a lot less than the split nitrogen application. So, and this was like 8 different treatments or 8 different site years associated with this in, looks like 3 years. So, and then here you can see that there is, though, a difference in the nitrogen uptake. And what I think is kind of interesting is you'll notice that we only applied 160 pounds of nitrogen. How did all of it pick up 216 or 225 pounds of nitrogen? You guys know? Well, it's that mineralization of that organic matter and all those kinds of things. So one of the important things to keep in mind is that, again, it's an ebb and flow in a situation like that. So if you are setting your yield goals for your soil test recommendations, and you want to say you want to say your yield goal is 150, but the highest you've ever had for a yield is 120. And so you go ahead and list 120 as your yield goal. And that doesn't mean that if the perfect conditions, like maybe last year for corn, come along, that you could only get 120. There's always some nitrogen available in the mineralization and in the organic matter process that when conditions are right, most of the time, nitrogen is not going to be the most limiting thing in ideal situations. So I just kind of wanted to point that out that, yep, that's quite a bit of difference. That's, you know, at the worst, it's talking about 60 pounds or almost 60 pounds of nitrogen that essentially was harvested from the soil. So, all right. Split and late nitrogen fertilizer applications are soil applied in post-flowering can provide in for corn uptake, because again, remember, that's about 30% of the nitrogen uptake at that time will happen, and that allows for a bigger window of in-season nitrogen application in corn, which is nice, because sometimes it's just not ideal. Sometimes the weather patterns haven't been conducive to that, and then sometimes it's been so dry that you may not need it. So that allows you to have that large window when you need it. It is more efficient. Nitrogen use is more efficient for late in applications. The yield response depends on the in-season nitrogen loss potential. So are you going to lose it through leaching? Are you going to lose it through denitrification? You know, all of those things are important to consider. And then the potential is there for a rescue application of nitrogen if you severely underestimated the yield potential and you need to go ahead and apply more. Any questions about, yeah, there we go. Any questions about nitrogen or something specific that you would like to know about nitrogen and how it might affect your nutrient management plan?
If you had one of them years that you raised more bushels per acre than the nitrogen put on, then the following year, should you maybe add a little more to nitrogen to make up for that?
Yes and no. Most of the nitrogen is goes through kind of a loss situation throughout the year. It's either taken up by the plant or somehow otherwise it is lost, unless it's, you know, very severely over applied, for example. You know, that happens more commonly in wheat in Western Kansas that is not under irrigation. If that amount of removal vastly is more than what you applied, you know, the previous year, I think it is warranted to go ahead and apply a little bit more that following year, but you don't have to put on 60 pounds more or anything like that, because remember, when you're harvesting a grain crop instead of a forage crop, most of that nutrient is going to be able to be recycled in that residue. So you're not losing all of it except for the portion that comes off in the grain. So that's something to keep in mind too. So that's why some of our no-till operations and situations where we're not cutting it for forage, it's less loss in that fashion. So
okay,
but yep. All right, so I'm getting close to out of time, but I'm actually moderately close to the end, so be excited, right? So sulfur. Sulfur used to be one of those situations that we just did not worry about it at all. What did I tell you? Is sulfur a mobile or an immobile nutrient in the soil?
it's mobile. Mobile.
It's mobile. Yes, it is mobile. So is a 6-inch soil sample for sulfur going to tell you really anything?
No.
No, it's not. So really, we need to come up with another way to figure out how much sulfur we might need to apply. Because in recent years, as we have moved to cleaner air, no threats of acid rain, those kinds of things, we've put lots of scrubbers and stuff on power plants and other things. The amount of sulfur that is naturally deposited on the soil has gone down pretty significantly. And the other aspect of that is that our yield in the crops that we grow has also gone up significantly. So essentially, we are removing more and more sulfur, and less is being applied naturally excuse me, through those processes. So one way that you can get a good idea of how much sulfur that you would need to apply is to do that deep profile sample. There is more calibration data today than there ever has been. So if you are willing to go out and pull even one from your entire field, a sulfur sample, so that would mean 20 sticks, 24 inches deep, but still one profile soil sample can do the job pretty well of estimating how much sulfur is out there for the crops that you want to grow. But if you do not do that and instead want to look at it in terms of removal, that is another valid way to consider the situation. And so knowing what the crop you're growing and what your kind of yield levels are, we are able to estimate how much sulfur you might need to reapply to essentially provide for the crop and not try to harvest it out of the soil that's there. So you can see that in general, most of our crops, corn and soybeans, which are going to be the most commonly grown, we're looking at 15 pounds of sulfur or less would be an adequate application. And quite honestly, you could probably get by with slightly less than that, especially if you don't have yields that are 200 or 60 for corn and soybeans. Alfalfa or anything that is a crop where we're removing the residue and growing something like that is going to be a heavier user. Now, so cool season grasses, about that 15, 16 pounds is a really good idea for most cool season grasses. So that's something to keep in mind. And it seems that our grass type crops, so our corn and our grasses, grain sorghum, for example, and the cool season grass are going to be the most likely to show those deficiency symptoms from sulfur.
Up there on that corn, if that's corn silage, is that the 15 plus the 18?
I don't think it's plus. I'm pretty sure that is some information that I did pull from my from that old notebook that I went for that class. I'm pretty sure it's 18 period.
Okay.
But I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's 18 period.
Okay.
So if I find out that I'm wrong, I'll let you know. So, all right. So micronutrients, not a lot that I want to share here other than to put this up here and say, yes, we can test for some of these things. The most important one that is here that we need to consider is going to be zinc. And zinc is important in corn especially, and then grain and forage sorghums, and sometimes in soybeans. But if we have 1 part per million or more, there is no need to add additional zinc. And so the number 2 test that the K-State Soil Testing Lab does, which we can cover for the grant that we have with the Conservation District, that soil test will give you all the basics plus zinc and organic matter. So if you would like to know that, and especially if you're going to be growing corn, that's an important thing to consider. But you can also see there are certain conditions of the soil that are the most likely to have zinc deficiency. So high pH soils, low organic matter soils, if you recently leveled it or there's been a lot of erosion, those are the cases where that happens. And you can see the cases where some of these other micronutrients, the deficiencies occur, but they're not very common. Even iron and chloride and boron, which are listed here, you know, they're just not extremely common. Boron is just a Southeast Kansas thing, and if you do have it, it's going to be where the pH is wrong. So remember, if we can keep our pH right, we shouldn't have a problem. Chloride or chlorine is a problem generally west of here with those grassy type crops because they have never needed to apply potash or potassium. Potash is always applied as potassium chloride. And so if they've never needed to apply potassium, sometimes they can get into a situation where chlorine, which is mobile, they're insufficient in having that. But iron is really very much a pH-based situation as well. So the last thing I wanted to talk about today is a nutrient management plan. And I'm not going to go into a great amount of detail other than to tell you that I am going to put it on our website, but I also would be happy to email and kind of discuss it with you because it's not the most user-friendly. But many years ago, I developed a spreadsheet in Excel in order to try to keep track of and predict phosphorus and potassium levels, and then keep track of soil test results so that you could make good decisions. One of the best things that you can do is to soil test a particular property the same way every 3 to 5 years. So if you grid sample it, then grid sample it again in 3 to 5 years. If you zone sample it again in 3 to 5 years. That can be one of the most important things because by the time that you get to year 9, for example, you can see the record of when it was in year 1, what it was in year 3, what it was in year 6, what it was in year 9, and you can really see where you're trending. And that's really, really important when you talk about phosphorus and potassium, which are nutrients that are immobile in the soil, so you can bank them if you don't use them. But if you're using more than you're banking, then you can see that level of soil tests go down over time. So this is just kind of a quick snapshot of the first page of this Excel spreadsheet that I made, and then it actually has a place, I think it's close to 100 different fields, and you can put how many acres it is and what you call that field so that you can tab between those and make that process fairly easy on putting in records and keeping those in one place. So this is a little snapshot of it's a lengthy as far as a horizontal spreadsheet, and I actually even still reduced it because it has a place for broadcast application, but it also has a place for starter and a separate place to put any manure applications that you would apply there as well. So it can really come up with a total nitrogen, total phosphorus, and total potassium application that is being made. So the way that this works is that on the first line or wherever you start, you would start with a soil test. And if you follow along on here, you'll see that you don't fill up any of this information because you're just getting a starting place. But you do put in here what the phosphorus level was. So in this case, this soil test came up as 12. And you put in what the potassium level was. And in this case, it was 180 for this field. And so then you would go through and you would say that I grew corn. And then you could estimate your yield. But again, it's even better if you can go back and put your actual yield in the end. Then you can put how much nitrogen did you apply, how much phosphorus did you apply, and how much potassium did you apply. And then it will do the calculations for you. So For every pound of P2O5 that you apply, well, actually, it's every 18 pounds of the applied nutrient is 1 part per million in change into the soil test results. So it's basically doing this math for you to see what are you doing to the soil test. And if you did that, your phosphorus parts per million would still be 12, but you would lower your potassium soil test an estimated 175. So you lowered it 5 points or parts per million. Then you can look here at soybeans. Let's say they were 40. If you've applied 60 and nothing, it does the calculations for you. You would expect then at this point that you raised the phosphorus level 2 points, and you've continued to decrease the potassium levels. Now, these are estimates. There are lots of factors that influence how this actually works out, but it does a really good job of predicting what you might expect. And then let's say that you then in 2022, you go ahead and run another soil test, which is only 2 years, but that's okay, who cares? Then you would actually recorrect. And so you would put in that soil test levels here, and you can see whether you were right or wrong. Now, one thing that I did not share today is that there can be some fluctuation in phosphorus and potassium, and any soil test for that matter, based on how many subsamples you took. I know I've said it many times, but I really strongly encourage people to consider 20 subsamples. But in reality, if we really wanted to be near perfect, we would have to get, 350 subsamples. No one's going to do that, not even me. So the reality of the issue is you could have some fluctuation. So let's say, you do your soil test and then you get it back and it says 10, and you're really alarmed in your phosphorus because it's supposed to be at 14 and it's now at 10. Well, that could be real, or it could be that the 12 was a little high that first time because of your randomized testing, and it really should have been closer to 10. So, that is something to keep in mind. So you're looking at trends over a long period of time, and that's why keeping records is a valuable thing that you can do for your nutrient management plans and making decisions about fertilizer applications. I really feel bad in some cases for producers that are choosing to let someone else make all of their decisions in regards to how much fertilizer is applied, because they may be spending way more money on fertilizer than they need to, or vice versa could happen. But most of the time, and that can really affect the bottom line, whether a producer can remain in business in some cases, especially when the cost of the nutrients is high and the value of the grain is low. So I really encourage people to learn a little bit more about it and make those decisions, or at least be involved in that decision-making process so that you can continue to cost flow and cash flow your farming operation, whether that be grazing, row crops or forages or any of the above. So my last slide is questions. What do you guys have for me?
You got me all my questions answered.
Oh, good. I'm glad I did that. Yep. There's a lot of stuff to know, but the good part is that you can feel free at any point to ask questions. Even a supplier is going to answer those questions rather well. And again, there isn't anything particularly wrong about trying to bank phosphorus and potassium because they generally don't run off real badly, but or leach out or anything like that. But again, when it's a matter of remaining in business and not remaining in business, that sometimes makes it a little challenging to stomach some of those recommendations and suggestions.
I guess I might have one question on that alfalfa. When would be a good time to apply that sulfur and phosphorus? In the spring?
Okay. Yep, I would say in the spring. Well, different for each one because sulfur is mobile. You know, applying it close to when it needs it is going to be always your best thing. Now, sulfur is not nearly as susceptible to leaching as is nitrogen, so you could probably flex that application a little bit. If you know that you need phosphorus, I would actually probably go ahead and apply that in the fall and go ahead and just put your sulfur with it so you only have one application. Again, you're not going to lose too much of it by doing so. But the reason that I would apply in an ideal situation the phosphorus in the fall is that, again, it is immobile in the soil. So it takes the freeze and thaw process and just the general time and rainfall to slowly start to move down deeper into the root system. So in an ideal situation, any perennial crop, you would ideally put your phosphorus and potassium on in the fall so that freeze thaw and time can help that process. And the same goes for lime, which isn't a nutrient exactly, but if you're needing to adjust pH, doing that in the fall is desirable.